We launch into that. Andy, would you mind leading us in prayer? Amen. Thank you, Andy. Before I launch into 2 Corinthians 9 this morning, though, there's something that I want to talk about. If you'll recall, during our last class on last Sunday morning, we spent some time talking about how important it is for churches to be open with their finances. Because if churches are secretive about that, then that offers all kinds of opportunities for corruption and ugliness. And just this week, there was a fairly major news story that broke about that kind of proves my point. Did anybody see it? What it was is the IRS basically never audits churches or the financial dealings of churches just because there would be such a great big outcry. But there was a guy who used to work for the financial arm of the Mormon Church, and then got to the point where, because of his work with that and some other things, decided to leave the Mormon Church. And as his going away present, he sent a big stack of all of the stuff that he was working on and had access to the IRS, and also to some newspapers. And what all of this information revealed was that, the Mormon Church says everything we do is nonprofit. We're doing it all for these charitable causes. But what they did is, from all of the tithes that they were collecting that were supposed to go to helping poor people, what they did instead was they built up a 100 billion, that's billion with a B, war chest, and have been using that instead of helping poor people to do things like bailing out Mormon businesses. So it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds, and I think that's an example that shows how important it is that everything that every church does with its money be open and available to scrutiny, because it is awfully easy for people who are able to operate in the dark to take advantage of the secrecy to do wrong. So that's an important takeaway from what we looked at in 2 Corinthians 8. But now it is time for us to move on to 2 Corinthians 9. Is there anyone here who would like to read 2 Corinthians 9, 1 through 5 for us? 2 Corinthians 9, 1 through 5. Volunteers to read. Doug. Oh. The funny thing is, that is totally the wrong reading. I told you the wrong reading. We are actually studying 2 Corinthians this morning. I told you 1 Corinthians. Well, we're on the same wrong wavelength, brother. That should probably concern us both. What's that? Let's try 2 Corinthians 9, 1 through 5. It's like... Thank you, Doug. So let's look at question 6 in our lesson books on page 11. It says, according to this text, what does Paul say the Corinthians already know about? Why is he sending messengers anyway? And what lessons can we take from Paul's wisdom here? So what does he say they already know about? What's that? I hear murmurs. Probably the murmurers are correct. What is it that Paul knows about? What's that? Yeah, they know about the need. They know about the collection for the saints. In fact, this is something that Paul told them about in 1 Corinthians 16. So he's told them, or he has told them before that they need to store up for this. And in fact, have they pledged themselves to act and help fulfill this need? Have they said that they're going to help with this stuff? Yes, they did. So why is Paul sending messengers anyway? Yeah, so they can be prepared and not embarrassed. Because here's what's gone on, is Paul has first gone to the Corinthians, and he has described this need to them. They have pledged that they are going to help with supplying the needs of the needy saints. Then Paul has gone to Macedonia and said to all the brethren in Macedonia, hey guys, guess what the Corinthian brethren have already promised to do to help with us? And so now Paul is coming back down the Greek peninsula, and he is bringing some Macedonians with him. And what happens if Paul has told everybody, yeah, the Corinthians are going to do great things to help with this work, and then the people that he told this to, they get down to Corinth and they discover that nothing has been done? How's that going to look? Yeah. It's going to make Paul look bad. It is going to make the Corinthian church look bad. And so what Paul is doing then is he is reminding the Corinthians, okay, you guys said you were going to do this. You are about to be called to account. So I'm sending messengers on ahead just to make sure that you are actually prepared to do what you have said you were going to do. So what can we learn from Paul's wisdom here? What does he teach us about being a spiritual leader? What does this show? What can we abstract from this? First of all, from the Corinthian perspective, it is important for them to keep their promises. It is important for them to do what they have pledged. But is Paul here making it harder, or is he making it easier for the Corinthians to do that? Yeah, he's making it easier. And is there a lesson that leaders today, whether in the church or in the family, is there a lesson that we can learn from that? Doug?
I see Paul recognizing how people are.
Yes.
Make this promise, but the delivery isn't due for a little while. So we kind of, I'll get to it. I'll put it my to-do list. I'll get to it. But we don't always get to it like we thought. He's trying to remind them, hey, I'm coming now. Now's the time to pull it all together.
That is exactly right. And what Doug relates is something that I think that any of us who have tried to motivate others to do something have realized. That people will often very quickly agree to do something, but then they will forget what they have agreed to do and end up not doing it. Or they will do it for 2 weeks and then they'll just kind of tail off. And so what Paul is doing to resolve this is he is giving them a reminder so that he is setting them up to succeed and not to fail. And I think a lot of the time we think of leaders as these guys who are out in front, the ones who are first over the top and they're waving the flag and trying to rally everybody to follow them. But a lot of the time, the best work that a leader does is quiet and it's behind the scenes. It's making sure that everybody is doing what they're supposed to. It is making sure that people are living up to their commitments. And with the result that when they are being effective, nobody is able to tell what they are doing because everything is running smoothly. Any other thoughts about this and what we see Paul doing here? Harvey. Yeah, and it's interesting that all the way through, whenever he is talking about a need to contribute financially, whether that's to the support of preachers or whether it is for the relief of the needy saints, that there is always some reason that he is giving why this is important, this is something that you need to put your money toward. Anybody else? Okay, then let's go on to question 7. And before we do, who would like to read verses 6 through 11 in 2 Corinthians? Look for that 2 in the upper left-hand corner of your Bible page. Anyone like to read 2 Corinthians 6 through 11? Volunteer. Anybody? Tony, thank you. Right. Thank you, Tony. So, question 7 says, according to this reading, what's the connection between sowing and reaping? What are we supposed to do about it? What will God do about that? And what will the result in our lives be? So let's start off. Paul says the point is this, so we should probably pay attention. What's the point? Yes. That if you put a whole bunch of seed on the ground, then a whole bunch of plants are going to come up and bear a whole bunch of fruit. If you only put a little bit of seed on the ground, then only a little bit of plants, or only a few plants are going to come up, and you're only going to get a small harvest. So what are we supposed to do about it? What does Paul say the application of this principle is to the way that we give to the Lord? Yes, that it has to start with the heart. And what kind of a heart does it start with, Billy? Yes, it has to start with a cheerful heart. What else is true of the heart, and especially in the early part of verse 7? That we are to give as what? Well, yes, as we have decided, as we have purposed. Well, everybody who said something there is right. That it is true that we need to give cheerfully, but it is also true that we need to give intentionally. That this has to be something that we plan to do and put in place. Why is that important? Yeah, that first of all, God doesn't really care about the dollar amount. He cares about what is in our hearts, so that's what pleases him. But just on a practical level, if we do not purpose and decide to give, then what is going to happen to our giving? Yeah, we're not going to do it. It's just like anything else, that we spend money on the things that are fun and that are immediately gratifying, but it's very easy for us not to spend money on things that don't give us that same jolt as buying the new toy. And so when we have decided, when we have determined, that's when we are most likely to follow through. Bradley. That is also true. And I think your comment there, Bradley, about how you won't just stop with the gift, that you'll follow through in service, I think that ties into the comment that Billy made about giving from the heart. Because if we have a heart that is devoted to God, are we going to give generously? Yes. If we have a heart that is devoted to God, are we also going to be generous with our time and energy too? Yes, we are. That just like so many other things in Christianity, it all goes back to who we have determined to be in our hearts and to our overall commitment to the Lord. And if we find ourselves not doing any of those things, that's a problem, but it is also a symptom of a greater disease. Al? Absolutely. And let's start off by acknowledging the underlying, or the difference between what we see here and what a lot of churches do. Do we see anything in here about tithing? We do not. Do we see anything anywhere in the New Testament about tithing, about giving a set percentage of our income to God? We do not. That is not something that is part of the law of Christ. It's just not there. Yet, why do most churches out there tithe? What's that? Well, that they are plucking something out of the Old Testament, but they take tithing and they don't take animal sacrifices. So they're not consistent in that. What makes them go back and get the tithing and not the animal sacrifices? What does tithing do for them? What do they think it's going to do for them? It's going to get them more money. You were going to say something, Zach? Well, I think that exists whether you are doing tithing or whether you are doing free will. We're going to give all the members here an opportunity to give this morning, and that's important that we do that. But I think the key is what Tony said, is that the reason why you see all these denominations talk about tithing is because they think that if they leave their members to themselves, then they're not going to give 10%. But if we put that 10% target out there and say, you must give 10% or else you're going to be displeasing to God, then they will twist people's arms into giving 10%. And in practice, it generally doesn't work out that way either, that what happens is they have set this mark that generally a lot of their contributors miss. But I think that when we consider what Al said, I think it's obvious why it is that God set things up in his church the way that he did, is it provides us with a way of measuring our hearts. It provides us with a way of revealing who we are. That God can look at that and use that along with many other things to assess our devotion to him. That, as always, free will is what reveals whether we are God's servants or whether we are serving ourselves. Because if God just made us do stuff, then that wouldn't show us anything about ourselves. Anybody else? Lee. That's exactly right. That ultimately, one of the things that should inform our giving is that everything we have is something that God has given to us. It's funny. I ran across somebody online who said that that's not in the Bible, the idea that we are giving back, and that's not true. That instead, that's something that we see among other places in David's prayer in 1 Chronicles 29. David says, from our own, or from your own we have given to you. And when we recognize that ultimately everything we have comes from God, that gratefulness, that grateful heart should inform the way that we give as well. And that's true not just of giving to the Lord's work, by the way. That's true of our generosity to the poor with our money and our time and our energy. Just all the things that we can do with our money that are good, those show our commitment to Him. So we are supposed to give from the heart. We are supposed to give generously. We're supposed to give cheerfully. We're supposed to give as we have purposed. If we do these things, then what is God going to do? What does it say in verse 8 that God will do? He will make grace abound to you. Is this like the forgiveness of sins kind of grace? And it is not. Andy is shaking his head. I hear no. And all of you naysayers are correct. What is it talking about when it says that God is able to make all grace abound to you? Andy? Yes. Because in the ESV, the verse goes on to say, so that having sufficiency in all things at all times, you may abound in every good work. Paul is saying, if you are generous, then God will bless you so that you always will have the opportunity to continue to be generous. And I think this is a point at which we need to make an important distinction. Because if we flip on the TV this morning, I'm sure that those public access channels will be full of guys who are proclaiming the gospel of health and wealth. And one of their favorite subjects is giving to them. And they will tell folks that this is a sevenfold promise day. That if you contribute $1 to me, then God will see to it that you get 7 times as many dollars back. What's the difference between that and what Paul is saying here? Can't. Yes, and that's a good point, that we don't necessarily have to think of this narrowly in terms of finances, that there are lots of ways that God gives us the opportunity for service. So that's worth noting. Billy, what do you have something? Yes? Yes? Yes, it is. Billy is asking, what is the greatest gift that God has given us, since this is a passage that is directed to Christians? And I think we all know the answer there. And it is ultimately the generosity that Jesus has shown to us that is to be the measure of our generosity to the Lord's work. But let's return, Doug.
Well, I think this idea of $1 gets you 7. It kind of introduces this ulterior motive to your giving, right? The intent here is you give as you purpose in your heart. God will bless that. God will, provide you the opportunity to still do that. It may not always be the same amount. You may end up giving less, but whatever it is that you purpose in your heart for God, you recognize Him as through His grace. It's not an accounting system, which is kind of how it's portrayed by the guys on TV. You give me $100, you're going to get 700 in a month, right? It's that kind of ulterior motive that's being introduced that says, put some seed money in here and you'll get the harvest.
Yes, I think that is definitely part of it. That the motive that Paul is appealing to here is very different from the motive that the TV preachers are appealing to. Because is Paul telling the Corinthians that they personally are going to be financially enriched by giving? No, he's not. That all he's saying is if you give, then God will give to you so that you can give again, with the result that there is no net physical benefits to the Corinthians. But that's usually not the way that the TV preachers are playing it, because they know that people generally are not that interested in altruism. What people are interested in is getting rich. And so just like you have some guy who is selling hot stock tips, so the TV preacher is saying that this is like your spiritual stock tip, that if you give this money to me, then God will enrich you much more. The preachers are playing it as a get-rich-quick scheme. They are appealing to people's greed, and sad to say, the result of that is always going to be that greed gets the reward that greed usually gets. Lee? That is certainly the case. I'm afraid that when we look at, I kid you not, back when we lived in Beaumont, Texas, one of our Sunday morning getting ready to go to church rituals was to watch some of those guys. And there was one, when we started watching him, he was on part 23 of a 27-part series on giving. 27 sermons in a row on giving. And you know, I like to think that I know the Bible pretty well. I cannot for the life of me imagine how you get 27 sermons out of the subject of giving. Unless, well, I think the answer to the question is that his heart really was in that. And the reason why his heart was really in it was because he was preaching every one of those 27 sermons on giving with the goal of enriching himself. And it's kind of funny, too, because in one of those sermons, he really got on the members for showing up at the local casino with their church T-shirts on. But the thing is, if you are looking for people who want to get rich, then exactly the same people who are being latched onto by TV preachers, who are manipulable through that desire by the TV preacher, that they are also manipulable by the casino, because it's the same thing that the casino is promising you. The casino is promising that it will make you rich. And so the same kinds of people fall for both things. And I think it is worth observing that in real life, whether you are looking to get rich from the TV preacher or looking to get rich from the casino or the lottery, it's not going to work. Those people are deceiving you always for their own ends. And it is sad that the gospel is misused in that way, but so it always has been. So anything else on this idea of God's promise that he will allow us always to be generous in our giving if we are generous? Let's go on then to question 8. Who wants to read verses 12 through 15? Anybody want to tackle that 4 whole verses? Zach, thank you, brother. Right. Thank you, Zach. So this question asks is, what blessings here does Paul identify that will result from the Corinthians' participation in the collection? To whom does he attribute those results? What does this show us about the plans of God? So what does Paul say is going to come about as a result of this collection? What good things does he anticipate? Yeah, first of all, You have these needy saints in Jerusalem. This collection is going to supply their needs. You have hungry brethren who are going to be fed because of the generosity of the Corinthians and others. What's something else that it does? Yes, that it produces thanksgiving to God. And who is it that is going to be doing the thanksgivings? Yeah, that on the one hand, the Corinthians themselves are thankful because they are able to give, as all of us should be. We must be grateful for our prosperity. But additionally, we see that the thanksgiving is also going to appear in the Jerusalem saints, that they are going to glorify God because they've been provided for by brethren elsewhere. Any other benefits that we see in this text? Yeah, that you have that these people in their thanksgiving, they say, look, these Corinthians and Corinth and Macedonia, they're real Christians. God be thanked that Christ has changed their hearts. So that will happen. What else? Look especially at verse 14. What good do we see described there? Yes, that the brethren in Jerusalem are going to long for and pray for the brethren in Corinth and Macedonia. And why is that a great big deal? Why, in fact, is that one of the reasons why Paul is doing this? What's the ethnicity of the church in Jerusalem? Jewish. What is the ethnicity of the churches in Corinth and Macedonia generally? Gentile. So how have Jews and Gentiles felt about each other for centuries before the coming of Christ? No, not real warm and fuzzy. If we think we have racism problems today, then just look back 2,000 years at how those folks hated each other and despised each other and would not associate with each other. So you have this barrier that has grown up between Jew and Gentile. Now they have all been made one in the church. And how big a deal is it that now, because of this contribution, you will have Jewish Christians longing for and praying for Gentile Christians? How different is that from the world? Yes, that is exactly right. That is utterly different. It would have been laughable for a Jew of that time to long for and pray for a Gentile. That, in fact, the Jews at that time, that they actually thanked God that they weren't born Gentiles. They hated them so much. And so for a Jew to look at a Gentile and say, these are my people, that is the kind of transformation that could only be brought about through the gospel. You have a comment, Billy? And that is certainly something that Paul is talking about, that this should be something that is obviously different, not just to the brethren in Jerusalem, but is obviously different to everybody who observes it. And that's the way that it should be in our lives. What does Jesus say in John 13? By this shall all men know you that you are my disciples, that you love one another. And when we care for one another's physical needs, that is when we display the love of Christ to everybody who is watching. Harvey.
When you die, that's the end of your obligation to Christ. That's the end of your giving, whatever. I know a couple of situations during London where the preacher would go to the family after the burial and request money that they said that individual owed the church.
And that's pretty slimy. And I will say a couple of things about that. First of all, it is true that our money is ours to do with as we wish. And if we want to leave money in our will to the church, that's fine. But for the preacher to go around soliciting from grieving family members, that's low. That's slimy. That is when you show that there is something that you love more than you love those grieving family members, and that is certainly not something that ought ever be done. In fact, I think that churches need to make sure that when they are talking about money, they are talking about it in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 terms. And you don't see Paul going around to individual people and trying to twist arms to get them to give. That's not something that we have to do, and it's not something that we should want to do either. Other thoughts or comments on that issue or anything else? Sister Lois. Yes. That is exactly so. What Lois just described is that with some denominational churches, if you go there and you pledge that you're going to give X amount of money a month and you don't live up to what is pledged, then they will send you a bill. I don't know whether they will turn you over to collections, but they will definitely send you a bill. And that too is something that does not befit the people of God, does it? That once we start caring more about money than about people, then we have gone astray. Anybody else here? Rufus. I think that's a great way to end it. That when we are talking about people who give generously and with a cheerful heart, that from what I know, that is something that is generally true of this church. This is something that we're doing a good job in. Now, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to excel still more as we have opportunity. But it is worth noting that we are not talking about this right now because the elders are looking out at the church and saying, these guys aren't stepping up to the plate when it comes to giving, because I've been involved in those discussions, and that's exactly the opposite of what the elders say in private about this group too. That this is a generous church. It is one of its great virtues. Anybody else? Okay, then let's go on to our final section and look at sort of the catch-all verses in 2 Corinthians. Let's go back to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. And we're going to be dancing here and there, looking at the things where Paul tells us to do things specifically. Who wants to read verses 5 through 11 here in 2 Corinthians 2? Larry. Right. Thank you, Larry. So in verses 5 through 11 here, what does Paul say about the brother who offended him? What does he urge the Corinthians to do? Why? What does he reveal here about his own spiritual attitude? What is he concerned about? And what does this teach us about how we should behave when someone offends us? So what does Paul say in the beginning here in verse 5 about this brother who has offended him? Whom has he really offended as far as Paul is concerned? Yeah, he's that this is somebody who, in being rude to Paul during Paul's painful visit, this is somebody who has really offended the whole congregation. What does Paul urge the Corinthians to do with this guy now that apparently he has repented? Yeah, love him, specifically to forgive and to comfort him. Why? Why is this important? Yes. Yes. And what Paul is, that's exactly right. That Lee observes that the reason why Paul told them to do this is so that he could see who they were. And what's going on here is there is at least one letter that we know about between 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians that we don't have. It's referred to as the letter of tears because of the way that Paul describes it in verse 4. So you have this letter of tears. And one of the things that Paul said in that letter was this guy needs to straighten out his attitude. He needs to repent of what he said to me. And now Paul is revealing that the reason why he said that was not because of his own personal offense, but because he wanted to see if that was something the Corinthians were willing to do. That was a litmus test. That he is, as always, concerned about ultimately their relationship with God rather than his own personal sense of offense. So what does this teach us about how we should behave when someone offends us? What should be our attitude? What should be our spirit if we learn from Paul? Is he somebody who is just determined to make this guy knuckle under so that Paul's wounded pride can be salved? No, that's not what Paul is doing at all. Do we sometimes behave that way ourselves when someone has offended us or even sinned against us? That we really want to get that apology from them so that we can show our moral superiority over them when they're crawling. We've all known that impulse, haven't we? That we really want to make somebody say the I'm sorry. But what's the problem with that attitude? What's the problem with being concerned about us rather than them when somebody does wrong? Several good answers, I suspect. Let's unpack those. Billy? Yes, that's a fundamentally selfish outlook, and we're not supposed to be selfish. Tony? Yes, that Christ was someone who, even while he was on the cross, he cried out, "Forgive them, for they don't know what they were doing." Jesus was not concerned about his own dignity, about people respecting him. He was concerned about them. And I think there was another comment there too. Nobody wants to fess? Yes, that we are to love even our enemies, that even when somebody offends us, the dominant emotion inside us is not supposed to be offense. It is supposed to be love. And if we remember love and Jesus and selflessness when we are in a situation where someone has done wrong to us, then that, I think, will lead us to the same answer that Paul arrived at. Anybody else? Sister Lois. Absolutely. Yes, that it is, I think, most important for us to learn to imitate Christ when it is most difficult. That it is not when we follow Jesus when it's easy that shows that we are disciples. It is when we follow Jesus even when it's hard. Anybody else? All right, let's try to sneak in one more. Over to 1 Corinthians 5, 20 and 21. I will read it very quickly. It says, "Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God." So, how does Paul describe himself and his companions here in verse 20 and 21? What does he do as a result? How does he describe the work of Christ, and what does this mean? So how does he describe himself and his companions here? What are they? Yes, they are ambassadors for Christ. And because they are ambassadors, what is it that they do? They represent Christ by saying to people, be reconciled. And that's an interesting idea, that ambassadors serve a nation, they serve a kingdom. And we're supposed to be ambassadors of the kingdom of God. And we are ambassadors to those who are at war with that kingdom. But the message that we have to share with them is not, we hate you guys, we can't stand you. That instead our message is, we want to be at peace. Come be at peace with God. Be reconciled. And that is something that ought to be true not just for Paul, but for all of us. So how does he describe the work of Christ connected to this? What did Christ do? Yeah, he provided the means of reconciliation. What language does the text use to describe the work of Christ here? Yes, that he became sin. He who knew no sin became sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God through him. What does this mean? There's the money question. Some of you are smiling because you see the trap. This is a debatable passage. In fact, this is one that Calvinists are fond of because it seems to imply that on the cross, Jesus became sin. Not just that he bore our sins, but that his own nature became sinful, so that when he died, it was just for him to die. Does that sound right? No. And you are correct to say that that doesn't sound right, because if you accept that, then that is an idea with all sorts of consequences that we are not going to get into in 3 minutes. But whenever people start talking about that's sort of a red flag. And I think we can understand what is really going on here when we look at the second half, when it says that so in him we might become the righteousness of God. Are we literally the righteousness of God? No, we are not. God's righteousness is a whole lot more impressive than we are. But what is our relationship to the righteousness of God? It is through Christ. But what is, how does the righteousness of, I can't figure out a way to ask the question that doesn't give away the answer. So I'll just go ahead and say, you want to try, Andy? Yes. 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 And I think that's the point. That we are evidence of, we reveal the righteousness of God through Christ, because it is God's righteous action that saves us. And so in the same way, when we consider the spectacle of the sinless Son of God nailed to the cross to die, what that does is that reveals our sin. It gives evidence of what our sin is. Because now, how bad does sin have to be for the sinless Son of God to die for it? Really bad, right? And so that's what we need to remember when we're talking about sin. All right, we're out of time. Thank you all for your comments. I guess this is actually it for the quarter. So thank you all for your comments throughout the quarter.